was just talking to Ian Hartman earlier this morning. And he mentioned this is easily the best attended session for an 8 a.m. Saturday morning that he's ever seen. I woke up this morning questioning my life choices. I'm glad there's both of us together today. Our first presenter in this panel, Planes, Trains, and Power, is going to be Pierce Bateman. Pierce was born and raised in Alaska and is a longtime resident of Anchorage. He's a graduate of both UAA and UAF and is currently pursuing a PhD in history at the University of Oregon. His current research centers on the 49th states, international relations, and the post-World War II period. For several years now, Pierce has worked as an adjunct instructor, teaching modern world history with an emphasis on Alaska at the University of Alaska Fairbanks Community and Technical College. His most recent article, Our Anchorage, an International Host, A History of Alaska's Bids to Host the Winter Olympic Games, 1947 to 1989, appeared in the spring 2023 issue of the Alaska History Journal.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming early. I'm not a morning person myself, so I got the struggle. I'm gonna put a timer on here, otherwise I will blather on about airports for too long of a time. But before I begin, one thing I'd like to, on a personal note, just acknowledge is that how wonderful it is to get to present alongside Dr. Ian Hartman today, because my very first conference that I did at UAA 8 years ago, he chaired and advised the paper for it, and my very first Alaska Historical Society conference paper, he also chaired that panel as well. So it's kind of a full circle moment, if you will, for me today. And I think also fitting that Ian's topic on trains is really kind of the birth of Anchorage as a place. And my topic is kind of the remaking of Anchorage in the post-World War II period. There was a moment in 2020 during the pandemic times when things kind of shut down, and this disrupted a lot of our air travel. And the Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport happened to be, for a brief moment, the busiest airport in the world. And now, out of our post-pandemic, well, sort of kind of a moment, we are still the third busiest airport for cargo in the world. But once upon a time, before cargo, before we were the cargo air crossroads of the world, we were the passenger air crossroads. And so that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. I dare say this is based on my first chapter of my dissertation, and I realized that in my abstract, I sold you a bill of goods that is rather the whole dissertation and a little bit too much to accomplish in one thing. So rather than my argument about what the air crossroads does, this presentation would be more or less just how the crossroads came to be, and I'll leave you with some thoughts about that after. Now, if technology willing.
Every time it works in the test and then it's not.
Yeah. Technology will be the death of me. Yeah, let's try that.
It might just come up. Right, China.
Okay.
With either.
There you go. Yay! Okay, so I draw your attention first to this map. It simply says air map. And I owe this to Terrence Cole because this used to hang a copy of this in the Arctic Northern Studies department up there. And I think this map is rather telling about the importance of places. Simply titled Air Map, this map destroys what cartographers had sought to do for centuries, which was to trace all of our intricate coastlines and all of the like I said, the intricacies of our world. And in a moment, American Airlines said, to hell with that, we're just going to have dots on a map, because why? The airplane erases geography. But curiously, what places are missing? And we've got two places in Alaska. We've got Fairbanks and Nome, which of course are playing a very significant role in the Lend-Lease program at this time. Anchorage is nowhere to be seen on this map in 1943. How can Anchorage be the air crossroads of the world? Well, Alaska has a number of shifting gateways and hubs. It shouldn't be new to us as students of Alaska history. What do I mean by a gateway and a hub? A gateway, of course, the entrance point either to get to Alaska, so Seattle, which we're all familiar with today, which is still kind of our gateway to get into the state unless you drive. But this has also shifted over time. It was also San Francisco. We also had ports in Russia that were our gateway. And still at this time, our gateway was Seattle. But in 1946, this changed. Anchorage itself became a gateway for Alaska in and of itself, a hub. But this was contested. The idea that Anchorage was a crossroads was first, I may be able to prove myself wrong with a little bit more archival research, but the first example I found of it was an Alaska Airlines ad from 1943 that said, Anchorage will soon be the air crossroads of the world. Pacific Northern Airways and responded and said, no, Fairbanks will be the aviation air crossroads of the world. Military leaders disagreed, and both of the towns really competed for this. Now, for those of you who had the pleasure of attending Leona Prax-Williams' wonderful talk yesterday on the Civil Aeronautics Board, she discussed how this agency basically made and unmade routes that determined where planes could fly in the United States, and particularly within Alaska. And there was a bit of a contest to see which airline would get to have the route to Asia, the route to Tokyo from the United States via Alaska. Now, Pan Am, since the 1930s, had been flying in the Pacific to Tokyo along Midway Island, Hawaii, along this kind of Pacific Basin island hopping route. But there was hope that something like this could be developed for Alaska. There were two airlines that competed for this, Pan Am and Northwest Orient Airlines. And CAB decided that Pan Am had a bit of a monopoly on air routes, and so they eventually decided to give this to Northwest Orient Airlines, which had proven itself during World War II to be a decent enough airline with flying experience in Alaska, flown in the Aleutians. Now, one of the significant developments that allowed Anchorage and Fairbanks really to become the major aviation centers that they are was that we needed airfields, right? So Elmendorf Field, Anchorage's kind of became the primary large military field there. Northwest Orient Airlines used to operate out of them. So in 1946, they won this battle with the CAB between Pan Am and Anchorage then became Northwest Orient Airlines' operating area, and Pan Am became Fairbanks. Now, they still both competed for this title of air crossroads of the world, and it was never set in stone that Anchorage would get to remain as the primary area, or that Fairbanks would, or that either of these airlines would stay in any of these places. The whole idea was that Alaska was strategic, that you could build an airfield anywhere and it could take this away. So both of these towns desperately feared the loss of one of their air routes by either of these airlines. And it was in 1953 that competition between the two cities really peaked. Scandinavian Airline Systems, or SAS, they had been experimenting with the idea of doing an over-the-pole route to either Anchorage or Fairbanks. Now, Fairbanks had been the seat of several over-the-pole flights or long Northwest Passage as well, and so it was thought, well, of course they'll choose Fairbanks. This is where it's been tried and tested. And Scandinavian Airline Systems tried both. I don't know if there's hi Bill. Dr. Schreiner did a wonderful interview with Einar Pedersen in the 1980s, who was the navigator and the main person who decided that it was actually a pilotable thing, that you could actually fly over the pole in a commercial way, and that it would be safe to do so. And anyway, he was able to prove that to SAS. They tried both Fairbanks and Anchorage, and with significant lobbying in Anchorage, Scandinavian Airline Systems in 1957 decided, after their trial and starting in 53 and continuing on, that they would choose Anchorage as their primary airport. And that had significant ramifications. Okay, so one thing I'd like to make clear in this making the crossroads section here is that the biggest thing that determines Anchorage's position and solidifies it as a crossroad, one is its broader Cold War context. Soviet airspace was off limits after World War II, but it's not just about airspace. It has to do with with markets. Japan was Alaska's largest trading partner for well over 50 years until 2013. It's taken over by China. East Asian markets are terribly important to Alaska, and it began really in this period. Not at first, we weren't trading with Japan until the 1950s, but in 1946, the United States government sought to use Japan as a bulwark against the Soviet Union and wanted to redevelop its economy, even at the expense of its own economy occasionally. And anyway, decided it would use Alaska, particularly Anchorage, to do this. So all of the boosters in Anchorage understood this because they were in contact with government officials, and so they kind of worked together. Bob Atwood seems to be the person so far, and we'll see if my research covers anybody else with such an outsized role, but Bob Atwood seems to have been pulling all the strings and levers in Washington to secure various business things, particularly with the airlines. He was instrumental in getting Anchorage its airport. So on this discussion of airport, talking about Crossroads, 1957, we can call Anchorage the air crossroads of the world. Why? Because Northwest Orient goes to it on the Great Circle route, and Scandinavian Airline Systems goes to it on the Polar route, which now brings Europe into this East Asian market. But Anchorage doesn't have its own airport until 1953. So how does this work? Well, for a long time, Northwest Orient Airline used Elmendorf Airfield's terminal. I was just chatting with Leanne about this, and it would blow our mind today to imagine civilians just kind of toddling on base going, okay, I'm going to pop my flight to Tokyo. But that's exactly what they did. They had a small little paper pass. I just bought one on eBay not too long ago. A little piece of paper that said, I have a ticket to Tokyo and I'm allowed to be here. And so they did. Anyway, they used the airfield. Well, Northwest Orient was already operating out of Elmendorf, of course, in the 1940s to operate the Aleutians. In 46, they start running the civilian flights there. But there was an issue with this. In 1946, Major General Craig gave the city of Anchorage an ultimatum. And let me see if I can find a quote here, and if I can't, I'll move on. I've got 50 pages of quotes and documents here that I didn't want to read aloud to you, must bore you, but now that I need the quote, terribly difficult to find. Here it is. He says, this is what he told to the Anchorage Chamber of Commerce. He says, Alaska is no longer on the brink of a new era. You are on your way. The new era is here, and it brings with it new responsibilities. What we want to be able to be sure that we are able to meet them. And then he told them, rather unceremoniously, that he would be kicking out all of the civilian flights from Elmendorf Field, and basically in no time would get the hell out. That they were going to be bringing B-52 bombers in from Fairbanks, and that this was going to be off. Well, let's see what happened here. So building a better crossroads. So Elmendorf Field construction started in 41, finished in 1941. The Army gives Anchorage an ultimatum in 1946. Fortuitously, the Federal Airport Act of 1946 is passed, which gives grants to states to have a federal money to build airports. What's the problem with that? We're not a state, thank you. So that rather throws a wrench in this federal funding. So it's not until 1948 that Congress approves federal aid for construction of an airport in Fairbanks and in Anchorage. So construction starts in 1951. The airfield was completed in 52. I believe it was being used already by that point, even though there really aren't facilities there. And the terminal is constructed in 1953. And I've got a bunch of pictures I'll show after this and talk maybe a little bit more about it. Let me get through a little bit more of a timeline here and kind of how the airport evolved through this period of crossroads. The airport terminal that existed in 1953 is basically partially destroyed in the great 1964 earthquake. They sort of kind of rebuilt it, but there were so many international flights coming in the 1960s that they decided to expand it, and they built the HEX, which I'll show you in a picture here, in 1966, and that was really the international terminal. Selton Terminal, which still exists today, though it looks a little bit different since the 2000s, was built, finished in 1969, and the North Terminal, which I don't know if I have another picture of it, so we have to go with this one, well, it was completed in 1982. All right, let's look at some pictures and then we'll talk about what all of this means. Okay, so here's our this is the P&A office, 1953. There's the original air traffic control tower there. This is inside the terminal. I can't remember who did these paintings. Leanne and I were just talking about this. The UAF library has got copies of these. Apparently they were destroyed in a fire, but this used to be what graced the airport. One newspaper article, 1963 from the lower 48, describes the airport, this terminal. Let's see if I can find that. May not. Feel like Terrence Cole. Where the hell are my notes? I'll leave it at that. But anyway, this is what the terminal looked like in the, before 1964. Here's our terminal here again before the 1964 earthquake, the original tower. You see all of these international jets that are flying in, the wonderful liveries. The destroyed air traffic control tower. We'll talk about who died in this in just a minute, because one of my arguments here is that the airport is a site of community space as well. Both life begins and ends, and also a lot of things are carried out in between. We'll get to that just in a moment. Or construction of the new South Terminal. And this is the hex, and people hated this, particularly the customs control people. They were so excited when this was built. It was a bit of a compromise. There was a proposal in the early 1960s with Anchorage's best mayor, George Beyer, who was an absolute nut. He tried to get the Olympics host. He tried to do a bunch of different things. The one thing he really accomplished was getting Anchorage's designation as an all-American city. But he was an excellent marketer. And he wanted to build this great hall of nations because he's like, well, God, we're having these foreigners stopping here. And this might very well be their only opportunity to stop in the United States. This might be all they see of the United States. We must build something to showcase what we've got here. So he tried to get all this funding, and he pissed off Ernest Greening, and he pissed off Bob Bartlett. Then he wasn't reelected as mayor, and then he went and retired down in California, and he was all done. But anyway, they built this hex, which was quite the compromise on that. One of the things that comes as soon as SAS secures its roots is that Anchorage starts calling itself on all of its city kind of paperwork, both the all-American city that George Beyer had us designated as, but also as the crossroads of the air world, thus kind of trying to pull this title away from Fairbanks, which could still sort of kind of claim it with a few international airlines, but Anchorage had a lot more by the 1960s. You can see here about KLM, Pan Am, which also has been sort of flying into Anchorage. Fairbanks wasn't the only one that had it. Northwest Orient, Canadian Pacific, SAS is hidden here, and eventually would grow to be 11 international airlines by the 1980s. Okay, so what does a crossroad even mean? What's in a name? Who came and why? Like I said, East Asia matters. It's a lot of businessmen to begin, a lot of US businessmen coming through in the United States, going to Tokyo to try to secure contracts. And then by the early 1950s, it's a lot of Tokyo businessmen coming in. And by the 1960s, it's this kind of jet set. Tokyo has kind of become a sexy place. And gosh, you could even stop in Anchorage if you're allowed to get off the plane. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. We had all sorts of celebrities, diplomats. There's basically a who's list of who stopped off in Anchorage in the late 1950s, really actually through to 91. And I'm working on compiling a list of basically everybody who stopped over and wrote something or said something about it, and those who actually got out of the airport and did something interesting in Alaska while they were here and see what they said. So that's a work in progress. But a lot of folks came, primarily from Europe, primarily from East Asia. Like I said, Tokyo is key, but by the late 60s, South Korea becomes a really important market. A lot of South Korean businessmen as well. And then eventually Taiwanese, Hong Kongers, and eventually China in the late 1980s. Anchorage welcomed them, for at least in the 1960s and early 70s. There were these great red carpet committees. They would literally roll out a red carpet, and people would deplane, and sometimes the mayor would be there and they would applaud everybody as they got off and hand people pins and stuff. And it was a real moment to try to drum up some business. You never knew who was going to be coming on the plane, or sometimes you did if the traffic office called ahead. And this actually isn't something new. This is something we used to do with the steamships when they used to bring people up. We knew anybody important was coming, or maybe they weren't even important, but you never knew, or word might get around. It was really good to put on the best show to try to drum up some business for early statehood era Alaska. George Beyer and a couple of our other mayors used to go on Christmas to the airport and used to hand out Christmas presents and pins and things because he said we want to give them some real American hospitality when they come here and give them that Christmas spirit. So I always think that's kind of interesting. As the 60s went on, Anchorage began to increasingly brand itself, not just in the signage like this, the iconic signage downtown, but also within restaurants and bars. There's the Crossroads bar on it's either Gamble or it's Seward Highway. I'm not sure where the Gamble. Yeah, oh, thank you, Joe. Yeah, on Gamble that has this name. There are many cafes, restaurants, and bars that at one point or another had tried to buy in on this title. Some stores as well. Even some of our street names kind of try to capitalize on our aviation, particularly our international aviation focus. All right, so I've got a line here. These are basically my note cards. If you can't tell, just some pretty pictures because I'm a little bit wild and off script, but I'm working on an idea of just the aspirational Anchorage, the Anchorage that could have been, all the things that we tried to do in the city and to fail to do, but what that says about us and our ideals. And so I mentioned briefly this proposed Hall of Nations, but there are all sorts of kind of bizarre ideas that come out of trying to capitalize onto this international population zipping in and out of. Oh, am I out of time? Oh no. Well, let me get to one more thing, and then I swear I'll be done out of here. So basically, by the late 80s, the air crossroads of the world declines. Howard Weaver said that Anchorage's star was a dimming one. And there were several reasons for this. One was volcanoes, which were too dangerous, that the long haul range jets were making it obsolete to even need to start over. The Gulf War, some terrorism, those of you who might remember the KO, or the Korean air flight that the Soviets bombed. And then, of course, the opening of Soviet airspace, which really changed this as well. I recommend our president's wonderful book, Melting the Ice Curtain, to have further information on that. But basically, Anchorage's air crossroads designation ended in 1991 because almost every single one of the 11 airlines that were flying in by the mid-1980s ended. JAL was the last one to go. Ended up coming in a year later, but it was only for cargo. Where does this leave us? Well, with a lot of lost money, if we use JAL as a case study, we lost $9 million a year when they left. 600,000 in state taxes, $1 million just for the airport in Anchorage. The duty-free shop brought in a ton of money and employed a lot of people. The folks who did the catering there, our hotels, and for our restaurants. A lot of money was lost in this. And that correlates to my very last thing I want to talk about here, which is that this airports need to be considered as a historical space. Before 2001, when the security changed how we interact with airports, people used to go and have a cup of coffee, go to dinner, do different things. I've been interviewing some different people. There's one couple who met at the airport cafe, proposed, did their honeymoon there, and has all sorts of wonderful memories of that place. People together, William George and Fred Taylor lost his life in the air traffic control tower. Kenji Iwabata shot himself over an incident at Mankey, saved his shot after poisoning a whole flight of people, which come talk to me after, I'm all over my time. But anyway, it's a site of homecomings and of leavings, of students going off to boarding school, students returning, of Vietnam vets touching the last little bit of American soil before going to war, and the first bit of American soil that they touched coming back. Something we need to investigate, not just here in the air crossroads, but at airports. So thank you very much for your time.
We will allow for a couple questions right now, if people have. If not, at the very end, we'll have time for more questions about all the presentations, but if anyone has a question, feel free to
shoot.
Can you maybe, and maybe this comes to Ian too, can you speak about the fuel supply lines for Anchorage versus Fairbanks and how that contributed?
I cannot, but this is something that I'm developing. I work under an environmental historian, and it's interesting. I'm trying to figure out how much gas came out of Kenai here. So much of that was shipped to Japan. I kind of forgot I was talking to a room full of great Kenai South Central folks who know damn well that Japan's markets really matter for that natural gas. And I've got some statistics on how much, per amount they pump at these wells, how much of that became jet fuel and how that got there, but I can't tell you in comparison. So if you know, find that out, do tell me. Okay. Any other questions?
Do you know who actually originated the Air Crossroads of the World? I always assumed it was some Chamber of Commerce PR guy.
It was, and I need to figure that out. The Alaska Territorial Chamber of Commerce in 1933 designated Anchorage as the hub of all Alaska. And then within a couple of years, they started using this crossroads term, not Air Crossroads of the World, but crossroads. It seems there was kind of a lengthy transition to that. It's in the early 60s, and it is the Chamber of Commerce that does it. I think 61, 62, it's around George Byers' time.
Thank you. Pierce.
Yeah, thank you.
9/11 airports.
What a time.
Wild. Our next presenter is Ian Hartman. Ian is a professor and the chair of the Department of History at the University of Alaska Anchorage. He researches and teaches on topics related to Alaska and the American West. He has recently partnered with the National Park Service and has also worked with the Anchorage Museum on exhibitions and continuing education courses. His latest exhibit, which opened in May and runs through February, explores the history of the Alaska Railroad. He is working with historian and retired railroad executive Jim Blasingame on a book that deals with the same topic.
Pierce is one of my very favorite students and people and has far more energy than me on a Saturday. I will not bring the boundless energy that you did, but thank you for waking me up a little bit more than my coffee was able to do. So I'm feeling a little bit energized now. I think this was supposed to offer out the Kenai, and I feel a little bit badly because we've got two somewhat Anchorage-centric topics. Maybe Phil can balance this out a little bit. But we've got the afternoon panels. We have a lot of really terrific sessions. So hopefully we'll talk a little bit more, I think, about the peninsula specifically, and I will indeed touch on it at least a little bit. I think by way of starting, and particularly again in light of Pierce's remarks, I'll start with a question, a trivia question. What is on the Anchorage municipality flag? Does anybody know? The Anchorage municipality flag. It waves, right downtown.
The anchor.
The anchor, yeah, the anchor is right. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so the anchor is right there in the center. What else?
Maybe something having to do with the train.
You'd think so, but you'd be wrong. Back, you have the anchor, you've got a really nice tall ship, and then you've got a plane up in the corner, but there's no train.
Oh.
And part of this, in me mentioning that you have this municipality flag directed, sorry, is that this drives railroad people absolutely bonkers. The reason for, as you point out, no offense to our plane folks, but it is the train that is the reason for Anchorage, and it is not to be found on the flag. You got a reference to sailing, you got a reference to Cook, presumably, and then of course you've got the plane, but no train. All right, so anyways, for my talk, I'm just curious if anybody picked up on that. Long before Anchorage was known as Anchorage, the local indigenous Dena'ina people referred to as Big Yaknu, what we know today as the shores of Ship Creek. The Upper Cook and those known as the Kotnu, and the Dena'ina have long stewarded the resources of South Central Alaska, where the railroad maintains its headquarters today. In fact, the railroad crosses not only Dena'ina land, it also crosses Tanana Athabascan land as well, upper and lower. So as we take a few minutes to reflect on 100 years of the railroad, we can just maybe recognize the far deeper history of the area and those who shaped the land in ways subtle and profound for over 1,000 years. Over the last 100 years, our story really begins much more closer to home in March of 1914, March 12th exactly. On that day, the United States Congress passes the Enabling Act, sometimes referred to as the Alaska Railroad Act. Just 2.5 pages of legislation, something that you almost couldn't conceive of happening today in any kind of legislative context. It was a sprawling piece of legislation signed into law by Woodrow Wilson that gave sweeping authority to the president to direct resources and construct and operate a railroad in the territory of Alaska. It was not to exceed, basically there were very few parameters placed on it. For one, it was not to exceed 1,000 miles. And the real goal of it was, of course, to connect the interior to the southern coast for the purposes of economic development and resource extraction. The construction of the Alaska Road ultimately involved 3 presidents and took roughly a decade to complete. Theodore Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, urged Congress as early as 1913 to initiate the project. There, of course, were other rumblings far before that. The history of railroads in Alaska certainly predates the Alaska Railroad. But for the most part, between 1915 and 23 is when the railroad is constructed. The railroad began operations in 1923 after Harding drove the ceremonial gold spike. I have like a sign here, click the image. I'm sorry.
That's it.
Back there. Hey. And in 1923, the railroad begins operations. You guys probably are familiar with this. So right now we're celebrating the centennial of the railroad. Here you see Harding, and this is a high-res image. Thanks. All of these photos are coming from the Anchorage Museum. Some of you maybe were in Nenana for the railroad celebration, the centennial. I should also mention, just before I forget, so a lot of this talk has been developed by Jim Blasingame and I. Jim is a retired executive with the railroad who's unable to be here. He sends his apologies and very much so wanted to attend. Jim's real focus was on transfer. So a lot of this topic, a lot of this paper, I should say, will focus on transfer. But I should at least, I think, recognize like the greatest hits and the topic, paper topic being the railroad bill, this image. You guys know what happens to Warren Harding shortly after this. What you can't probably see in this photo is that it's quite warm that day, July 15, 1923, probably in excess of 80 degrees, by some accounts even closer to 90. So you all know the interior gets quite warm. Harding may have eaten some crab sitting around at 80 degrees. Not a good idea. There are other, rumors about, his philandering, but the story goes he makes his way out of Alaska, makes his way to Seattle, gets increasingly sicker, makes his way somewhere between Seattle and San Francisco and dies. So it's likely that Alaska seafood killed Warren Harding. An open question, but what is certainly not an open question is that this is really the kind of marking the beginning of the road, which is why we're celebrating the centennial today. During the construction effort, Alaskans had started to taken calling it the government railroad, since it was owned and operated by the federal government. And it mobilized the resources and project management that only the federal government could provide, which is, of course, a key point. That's going to be a through line throughout this talk, is the role of government involvement. Technically, the Alaska Road was considered an independent enterprise, operated by the federal government. We're probably parsing words a bit. It is the only federally owned, operated, constructed railroad in the United States through this time, and would remain so under federal ownership until 1985. Under federal ownership, the railroad subject to policies which restricted its ability to compete, which is going to be a constant source of tension that we could talk about. And it was the federally owned and operated Alaska Road that was responsible for a share of its obligations. So, I mean, it operates in a very interesting way compared to maybe other federal agencies, but also state agencies once it is transferred to state government. In addition, the railroad has significant cost overheads, and it's probably worth noting that the railroad does not make money. It is a huge money pit for the federal government for years and years and years, certainly from the 20s into the 30s. And like so much else in Alaska, it's World War II that transforms it. You cannot overstate the impact of World War II and of course the Cold War, and we're getting a little bit of that from Pierce's talk as well. Couple more images here. So the Cold War, World War II and then the Cold War really do illustrate how important Alaska becomes to the nation's strategic defense. And it will reveal the future role that the federal government will continue to play in Alaska. And in fact, as we also probably all know, federal appropriations play a greater role in Alaska on a per capita basis than just about any other state. I guess maybe a few other places could maybe give us a little bit of a debate, but for the most part, the role of the federal government in Alaska remains central to the economy. Now, just a couple of quick cutaway pictures here. So during World War II, Alaska Native participation on the railroad was primarily towards maintenance, called the Gandy Dancers. Here you see the holing through the Whittier Tunnel, which opens in 1942. This is the spy train. This is classic Cold War. By the way, all of these images are from our exhibit at the Anchorage Museum. If you haven't been to it yet, it'll be on display for another couple months. But this is like kind of high-tech 60s, 70s, really runs through the early 1980s before state ownership, but it's marked Department of Transportation. But if you go inside, this was to serve as the Alaska Air Command's alternative command post in case of some kind of high-level invasion. So you would see these windowless spy trains, they came to be called, creeping down the tracks from time to time. Some of you may have memory of them. So what I'll spend the bulk of my time talking about now is really what happens to the Alaska Railroad to move from federal to state ownership. That's really the emphasis that my partner in crime on this, Jim Blasingame, has focused on, and then it's also what I want to talk about the most. I get a sense that, again, most people are familiar with the Harding story. Most folks are familiar with the early days of Anchorage, the tent city, some of that other stuff. But the road to the railroad tracks, the state ownership, sort of bad metaphor, really begin with the 1964 earthquake. In the aftermath of the 1964 earthquake, what starts to happen is that you see the federal response, particularly at the highest levels, kind of slow. And the railroad employees actually do an amazing job of rehabbing the railroad. And if there is I think a Kenai focus, or a Kenai Peninsula focus to this talk, it would be sort of on the railroad track down to Seward in the aftermath of the earthquake. The workers get on this immediately, and in a real feat of labor, really, I mean, are able to patch this up and get it working again. But there's a feeling that they did not get very much federal support. And so by the mid 60s, late 60s, people are starting to say, why is it that the federal government owns this road? Maybe the state could do it better. It wasn't a widespread feeling, but it was still one that was pretty pervasive and growing. The 1970s, particularly post-oil, the development of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline is when this reaches a real fever pitch. This is the 50th anniversary of the railroad here. We should not be doing this. I was actually just listening to the radio this morning, and the Alaska Railroad buys these spots on public radio, and we thank the Alaska Railroad for contributing to public radio. Here's a spot that don't walk on the tracks. Anyways, the problem with the pipeline era was that, again, the railroad did not really utilize this opportunity to make much money. And so you've got this enormous boom going on throughout Alaska, and the railroad's kind of off on the sidelines. I mean, it did contribute, but its primary contribution to the pipeline construction is actually using its land. And so those of you who are familiar with the railroad and its history, you might know that kind of one secret to the railroad's finances is its real estate holdings. And so it allows the construction to occur on railroad land. It allows all the pipes to be stored on railroad land, but it's not actually involved in the day-to-day construction effort, where whereas many of the railroad kind of felt that it should be. So in this context, Ted Stevens, among others, really start to make the claim that it needs that flexibility to engage in what you might call more of an entrepreneurial mission. That is extraordinarily clear by the late 1970s and early 1980s. Interestingly enough, the governor of Alaska at this time, Jay Hammond in the 70s, is very much so opposed to the transfer to state ownership. He's opposed, Jay Hammond, a Republican, he's opposed because he thinks it'll be a white elephant. And he's on the record saying, you know, this is going to be deferred maintenance, it's going to be a huge problem, let the feds deal with it. And he's not entirely wrong about that. And in fact, in the wrangling that goes on to kind of evaluate the railroad, the feds want to sell it for market rate. Alaska wants to buy it for basically a song, and they have to figure out what the valuation would be. Very famously, of course, this debate's occurring precisely when the first PFD check is dispersed. And so there's a famous interaction with Ted Messenbaum, the senator of Ohio, where he gets up on the Senate floor, and he and Ted Stevens had a terrible relationship for a pretty good period of time, and then they patched things up and actually were quite close later on. But he kind of points out to Ted Stevens, how is it that you're sending all of Alaskans checks of $1,000 when, and now you're telling us you can't buy the railroad for rate? And so this goes on. And Ted Stevens' primary point, and it was a good one, that we are going to buy it for cheap, but then we're going to have to have the deferred maintenance. And so we're going to have to take care of it, and we're going to have to put all this money into it after the fact. And sure enough, they will go through this quite rancorous evaluation process to bring it up to a price that they can agree on, and the sale takes place for $22.3 million. Again, not a bad deal. I think Alaska wanted to buy for significantly less than that. Jay Hammond now is out of office, and then of course you have Bill Sheffield. Bill Sheffield, a Democrat, actually is going to be much more aligned with the Reagan administration on this. The Reagan administration wants to sort of devolve things to the state, wants to shrink the imprint of the federal government. This lines up quite well with the idea of selling the railroad. And so one of the, I guess, questions or, kind of things we can pontificate on here is if you would have had a situation where Jay Hammond had come later and Bill Sheffield earlier, would this deal have gotten done? I don't know. Possibly not. But it does line up with the timing. You get the Reagan administration with the new FRA administrator. You get Bill Sheffield, who wants to get the railroad in. Bill Sheffield, again, if Jim was here, would tell you this guy is like the biggest train enthusiast you would have ever met. He made it his personal mission to ensure that the railroad was transferred. And on January 5th, 1985, the railroad passes into state ownership. So it's a really a process that begins in 1981, takes place through the valuation, and then finally occurs in 1985. The Alaska legislature provides a one-time $11.5 million startup fund. To this day, the Alaska state legislature does not take responsibility for funding the railroad. It does secure federal appropriations because of its passenger service. But it is that time, or is it just but it is somewhat self-funding. But again, the point I would make here is that it's going to remain dependent on federal subsidies, at least to some extent. It will have much more flexibility in its operations under state ownership, and it will exist, of course, in state government in a very fundamentally different way than other state agencies. Why is that? Well, it is run through a board of directors, and it's taking a page from Amtrak. So those of you who are maybe familiar with the railroad and how it operates, it's got a board of directors that, again, very much so industry standard at the time. The board of directors would have included the commissioner of transportation, the commissioner of economic development, a member who has 10 years of management experience at a major railroad outside, a member of management experience of a company of at least 50 employees, and a member to represent the railroad's unionized workers. The railroad was and is the union shop. The board hires and fires the chief executive to serve at pleasure. And probably more importantly than anything, the railroad under state ownership has bonding authority, which gives it the ability to raise money and actually engage in capital projects. And it can also, of course, continue its passenger service. So under federal ownership, there were moments when passenger service struggled. There's the famous Aurora train in the 1950s. The passenger service has become really central to the Alaska Railroad since the transfer of state ownership and the addition of these double-decker luxury cars with the viewing decks. The railroad went ahead and built at the time was Mount McKinley National Park, now Denali National Park, the depot there, and really leans into its mission as freight, but also passenger as well. The augmentation of the Alaska tourist industry is also, of course, deeply connected to the railroad over the last 30 years or so. It now contracts with the cruises, with the cruise ships, and you guys may have seen the Princess Line painted Alaska Railroad cars making their way up to Denali or down to Seward. A study by the University of Alaska's Institute of Social and Economic Research found that the railroad supported 1,900 jobs, $90 million in payroll, and the railroad spent $108 million and indirectly supported an additional 450 jobs throughout the rail belt. Most of those are in Anchorage, but there are, of course, full-time railroad jobs spread out throughout the rail belt. The figures are probably a little bit outdated. We live in a time of inflation, so if anything, those numbers are actually significantly more. Now, I think the number of railroad employees is probably about the same, but the economic impact is certainly greater. It has had a rocky history since its founding. It is a railroad that has run out of money and made a little money and run out of money and has faced headwinds from earthquakes. But for the most part, the Alaska Railroad has remained central to the state's economy and its culture. As Alaska searches for ways to diversify its economy, the railroad might be a pillar of the state's future growth and development. We could talk a little bit about what the future of the railroad might hold. That's an interesting discussion in its own right. But it's worth concluding with the notion that the Alaska Railroad, like much else in Alaska, from its marine highway to its university system where I work, to its managed tracts of land, is a public institution, despite critical and even obvious differences from the examples of, say, the highway system, the marine highway, or the university. Many Alaskans claim that we live in the last frontier. It's on my license plate. It's on our state song, right? A deep strain of individualism has defined the Alaskan ethos. We might even say that there's a cynicism towards government, be that at the federal or state level, and it does indeed continue to pervade our discourse today. But yet, the story of the Alaska Railroad is one of collective action, robust public engagement, and government involvement from the beginning right through today. It's a reminder that Alaskans are best off when we work together in the public interest to leverage our small population to do big things. So I'll leave you with just two more pictures that I think embody that spirit. Here you got some workers on the Alaska Railroad. Again, constant maintenance. Any railroad, those of you who are familiar with the history of American rail know that you've got to basically be on call 24/7. And so the workers in the Alaska Railroad are always on call. This figure over here to the left, Harry Ross, a fixture on the railroad for 50 years to this day, the longest serving railroad employee, passed away just a couple of years ago, just months into his retirement. He was known as the singing conductor because he would go up and down the rail car and sing. And he has these this is a little bit of an awkward photo. He's got these handcuffs because he would threaten to arrest the old ladies on the railroad who would fall asleep, and he would gently tap them on the back and say, "You're under arrest." Sleeping on the railroad. I don't know if you do that or not, but he turned into this. He was also a blues singer and played in like this kind of disco punk band around town. So Harry Ross was a beloved figure with the railroad and is greatly missed and served as a corporation for, like I said, about 2 years. So people like this who really do embody the spirit of the railroad. Okay, thank you. That's all I got.
We can take a couple of questions now, And as I said before, there'll be an opportunity at the very end too, but.
Yeah, if people have time for a side trip. They should visit Whistle Hill, which is just east of town. Where you can have coffee or whatever in a Alaska Railroad, gondola park. 57 miles from where they're going.
Yeah, you see some of the Alaska, so I'm channeling my inner Jimmy Blasen game here. You see those cars and they are, again, they're part of the Alaska landscape. They are not supposed to be marked. The Alaska Railroad is this kind of trademark symbol, and so the one I noticed coming in it just says Alaska on it. It doesn't say Alaska Railroad. So they are actually in compliance with that. Some of the other ones are not in compliance with the Alaska Railroad.
Ironic.
Yeah.
That would be here.
Yeah.
There's.
That's the point. Yeah.
I'll kind of Cindy Kenai, is there a chance of the railroad ever extending down to this one?
Strongly doubt it. The short answer is I doubt it. I mean, there's a lot of, I think, boosterism about the A to A, the Alaska to Alberta. I strongly doubt that will ever happen. I mean, it's fun to think about. I suspect right now, the railroad's primary emphasis is on just kind of shoring up the rail belt. I don't know of any imminent plans to expand other than this kind of interesting A to A idea that would presumably connect into Canada to the tar sands and then basically work its way down. The idea would be that you would use the Alaska Railroad to haul that oil that comes from the tar sands to Alaska, because British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, California refused to ship it for various environmental reasons. But I don't imagine a situation where that will ever happen. I don't think it pencils out. So the short answer is probably not.
Did the Alaska Railroad actually develop a system to feed river traffic into Nenana, bolster freight? The reason I ask is that a bunch of us are concerned about the SS Nenana and Fairbanks. And that used to be used as a service to feed people and transportation into railroad communities. And I don't know if that was a business plan or if that was organized in that fashion.
Ron, I don't know. That's a great question. The key to maybe finding that out would be to understand a little bit more about the precise inholdings and land management that the railroad has right along that area. I don't know if they would have charged a fee other than maybe, again, leasing the land around there, which they may have had some claim on, but I'm not aware of any fee. It's a very good question. Austin, yeah.
This may be a whole other topic for another presentation, but I've read some stuff talking about that back when Seward was the headquarters of the Alaska Railroad, before the private enterprise defaulted and went bankrupt, and then it was turned over to what you were talking about, that one of the issues was that there came a time when the head of the railroad and the mayor of Seward turned out to be two guys who hated each other's guts. And that the railroad then moved its headquarters from Seward to Anchorage, in part because of this personality clash, and there were some characters involved with that.
Oh, absolutely. So there are probably 4 or 5 different talks that I had just off to the side of this one, much like you peers. One conventional talk I think you'll have on the railroad is why Anchorage. And the short answer to that is that the Fed, there's a small land rush on Seward, pumping up the price. People are more or less betting on Seward. There's the personality clash that you're speaking about. But more than anything, if you think about Seward logistically, it's hemmed in by the mountains and the water. And so you don't have the space to really have this large scale infrastructural project. And so what you're describing is very likely true, but the reason that Anchorage is ultimately going to be chosen is because that along Ship Creek, you just have more space to sprawl out, establish a headquarters, and actually launch this enormous effort. federal appropriations, you guys may have heard the statistic in 12, 13, in the aftermath of the Enabling Act, the Railroad Act, roughly 10% of the federal budget is gonna be dedicated in its early year, I think the first year, maybe the second year, to the Alaska Railroad. For scale, I run this figure by my students, so what's our budget today? Where's? Yeah, I'm looking at my federal employees.
We don't have one right
That's a good.
now. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know, what's the federal budget these days? It's like a couple trillion, so what's 10% of a couple trillion? 200 billion? I mean, I'm not a mathematician on this story, but imagine, hundreds of billions of dollars coming into Alaska to support, I mean, it would solve all of the problems. But that's what you're dealing with in the early years of railroad construction. I mean, the federal government has a much smaller imprint than it does today. Obviously, World War I is going to change that. World War II totally changes it. But the fact is, I mean, if you have that much federal dollars coming in, Seward just wasn't particularly well equipped environmentally to handle the crush of people, of manufacturing, everything else. I mean, like Anchorage industrializes in what amounts to like a couple of months. I don't think Seward could have done that given again its particular geography. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Cynthia Wentworth. I'm a former employee of the Railroad
You
Corporation.
know more about this than I do.
No, I don't. You know a lot of things I don't know, and I used to work with Jim Blassingame, and I need to give him a call on Monday. I'm really interested, I mean, I love that you're doing all this historical work, but I'm really interested in the future of the Alaska Railroad, given that the Alaska Department of Transportation keeps leaving the railroad out on the excuse of the way they're arranged.
Yes.
And from a climate perspective, that's a disaster, because the railroad gives up 1/3 the emissions of highways. And if you look at this, and I'm getting ready to write an article about this, and privately, the people who run the railroad know that I'm doing this. They've even fed me information, but they have to be very careful.
Sure.
Because of the administration right now. Okay. The state, I mean, despite doing so much work, the railroad and me, on the state DOT 2050 plan, they still live the railroad out. They're planning all these expansions to reduce bottlenecks when the railroad track is right there, in the words of one of the railroad presidents.
Yeah.
Or vice presidents. I don't want to disclose names,
Sure.
but you see what I'm saying? We need to look at the future right now. 1/3 the emissions is highways, and we're just building more highways. And we've got to do something about that.
So I'll defer a lot of the environmental topics to my colleague, Professor White, who will touch on some of this before. But there's no doubt that the railroad could conceivably play a part of a lower carbon footprint for Alaska.
Huge,
I mean,
huge.
this has been discussed. I think the example that oftentimes comes up is like using it as a commuter rail from the valley to Anchorage, which would have, for one thing, the practical effect of getting people off the Glen Highway during a time when, speaking of climate change, when we're getting more ice and snow for a big chunk of the year, and the Glen Highway is a total mess and it's dangerous. There was a plan in the 90s, early 2000s, to go ahead and really develop that commuter connection. The story I know is that a certain Wasilla mayor sort of reneged on some commitments, and that never happened. There was a plan to build this commuter station, and the railroad did in fact enter into like some informal agreements. The railroad goes back a couple months later in the summer to start construction on it, and there's like a housing development that's being built. I mean, that's just an anecdotal story to share, but I think you're quite right that if Alaska is serious about addressing climate change, and Alaska wants to be part of this bigger conversation, the railroad could indeed play a really central part of that conversation. The fact that it's not, of course, gets into the politics, it gets into some really kind of fascinating points of discussion, but yeah.
Well, when Governor Walker was governor, we had a task force, and I was on the task force, and we almost got it then. That's the closest we came in 2018.
Yeah.
But then when he was out of office, that kind of died for now, even though Sheffield tried really hard to keep it going.
Yeah, and so it's an open question, but I dearly hope that that we have it.
Okay, good.
So we are gonna segue to Phil's presentation. Thank you,
Yes,
Ian.
thank you, gentlemen.
Once Phil's presentation is over, we'll have questions for Phil, but there'll also be time for more questions on the railroad. So our final presenter, Philip White, is an assistant professor of history in Arctic and Northern Studies at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He's an environmental and energy historian and focuses on histories of infrastructure, mobility, and climate.
All right. Well, I feel very fortunate because with those two topics, I feel like I'm well set up to talk about electricity and electrification. So maybe a good place to start the story is one where an onlooker down in Juneau in the early 1890s. And if you were in the center of town flows a creek named what else? Gold Creek. And here at this central stream was likely where the first hydroelectricity was generated in Alaska. Less than a decade after Pearl Street Station in Manhattan, right? Thomas Edison's innovative central electricity project came online in 1882. Alaska had centralized electricity, right? That's really remarkable. And so part of that quote that I just gave comes from Gwen Holdman, who's at ASAP up at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And she's written a little bit about this in her work. So following Juneau, boosters brought electricity to Dawson, Yukon by 1899, and to Fairbanks by 1903. And so what I want to talk about in the next 20 minutes is the electrification of Alaska. It's a huge subject. I'm only going to cover a tiny slice of it. But there's a lot of different ways that we can try to wrap our minds around this, right? I love this beautiful photo from Cordova. We'll talk about the Copper River and Northwest Railroad, the importance of electrification there. You really love that. You can't lecture on a technology topic without having a technological. Right? There we go. Okay. So you could think about Alaska's electrical history through this intriguing graphic. This comes from Launch Alaska, the state's clean tech and climate incubator. So you can think about the different technologies that have been crucial for electricity in the state. And I could say, so many of our projects deal with infrastructure. We really take electricity for granted, right? Most of us don't give it a second thought unless it doesn't come on. We have these little wires that interconnect us and they're so thin. And it's basically the equivalent of magic, right? The fact that we can have water that flows down here through Bradley Lake, right? The most important hydroelectric facility in the state. And it almost instantaneously is electricity that can be used in Fairbanks. I mean, that's magic to me. So we can think about the different technologies here, right? This is one way that we can talk about the history. I've been doing, some of this research comes out of projects that I've been working on for the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. One of them is creating a generation and transmission history of the rail belt. So I've been mapping every single power plant that has been built on the rail belt going back to 1904. Right, so this is one way that you could do it to try to think about power capacity, or the aggregate number of these individual generating and transmission facilities. This is an early map of what some of that early chart of what some of that research is going to look like. What's often said is that throughout the rail belt in Alaska, our total electricity demand is about half of a normal power plant in the lower 48. As Terrence Cole would always say, Alaska might be a big state, but we've always been a small market, right? So that's something that contours our history here. Or you could graph it geographically, right? This is from another wonderful ASAP project. My colleague Chris Pike made this. And so to think about how the electricity has grown over time, grown geographically throughout the state. And what we can really think about here is networked electrification. By some measures, the US electricity grid, or the North American electricity grid, is considered the largest machine ever invented by humanity, right? Alaska, we are disconnected from that grid, but we're still part of that story. So I want to offer four themes about what has contoured Alaskan electrification, right? How do we understand the socio-technological process? And there's numerous ironies and paradoxes that I hope to talk about. Those four themes are colonization, innovation, public power, and then diversity, and what I rather inelegantly call depetrolization. We can talk about that. And so for the first one, colonialism, colonization, huge term, there's a lot to unpack here, but just basically, we think about even something like the rail belt, right? And it's somehow a naturalized concept, but where the railroad was going to be routed, where Alaskan settlement was going to follow, that was not a given, right? That depended on certain forces. And so I think it's worth really being explicit about those. The enormous power of the state, right? And I mean that term quite capaciously, both the federal government, but also the territorial government and then the state of Alaska. Those entities really sanction certain energetic activities, right? So whether it's the building of Bradley Lake, whether it's the not building Susitna, whether it's building a nuclear reactor at Fort Greely, right? All of those things are structured by the state and really limiting what resources can be used, right? We think about President Roosevelt's withdrawing of coal lands in 1906, right? That's hugely consequential for the state of Alaska, not just for Cordova and Katalla, but also Fairbanks during that period. We can also think about missionaries and the Bureau of Indian Affairs setting up certain schools in locations that Euro-Americans deemed preferable. And these installations were often the first non-commercial providers of electricity in rural Alaska. Around these government-sponsored installations emerged more permanent villages, right? And electrification followed those developments. And so I think this is perfect to think about connections and disconnections in Alaskan history, right? The topic of our conference. So while the state is both being connected with electricity, there's also disconnections there, inequalities, right? Electrification has been a profoundly uneven process throughout Alaska. Even still to this day, those of us on the rail belt or in Southeast Alaska benefit from quite inexpensive electricity compared to rural Alaska. We can also think about innovation here, right? And there's an irony here. Innovation in electricity has often happened in Alaska in remote places, or places that didn't have access to easy fuel resources or money, right? So we can think about kind of bootstrap innovation. Rural Alaska, I think, is clearly king here. We see some of the first large-scale wind generation in rural Alaska, a lot of experiments with that. Still to this day, places like Kotzebue deploy more wind power per capita than almost anywhere else in the state. Yet we also have innovation throughout the rail belt. Fairbanks, for a long time, had the largest battery in the world. GBA's battery energy storage system, the BESS up there in 2003. And that was an innovative development because the intertie would trip occasionally and we'd have power issues up in Fairbanks. You can also think about the lowest temperature geothermal electric power up at Chena Hot Springs. That was quite an innovative development. I consider Chena Hot Springs on the rail belt, even though technically it's not connected to the rest of the power grid there. Or we can think about backyard micro hydro in Eagle River, right? There are entrepreneurial Alaskans who are literally building their own hydroelectric generators in their backyards and connecting it to the rail belt. Third theme that's really important here, public power. I mean, this goes exactly to what Ian was talking about, and even the public funding of the Anchorage airport. Due to Alaska's remote and rural nature, for-profit companies only offered electric service in limited locations. And so Alaskan power development has been dominated by public agencies, both in terms of rural electric cooperatives, but also the federal government through the military, through the Bureau of Reclamation, right, developing Klutna Hydro in the 1950s. Yet there's a certain irony here, right? So we have all these rural electric co-ops that are in theory owned by their owners, right? We're getting power right now from Homer Electric Association. Yeah, the history of these co-ops has not always been the most cooperative. I can say a little bit more about that later. And ironically, the rail belt cooperatives have fought with each other while at the same time supporting more rural electric cooperatives. Matanuska Electric Association helped to sponsor Unalakleet, and GVA helped Barrow create their own electrical cooperatives back in the 60s. It's also really important to think about public power and decarbonization. The first 6 cities and kind of municipalities in the United States to achieve 100% renewable power, they were all publicly owned. Kodiak is one of those here in Alaska, right? 99.999% renewable. Okay, if we want to be technical there. The last topic I want to talk about is fuel diversity and what I call depetrolization. I need a better word for this, right? Alaskans have always been interested in utilizing a variety of energy sources, right? Some of that has to do with the seasonality of an energy source, right? Even some of our early micro hydro, the stream would only flow for a certain part of the year, so you'd have to have a diesel backup generator. What's really interesting is that, as the rest of the world is talking about decarbonization right now, Alaska has long been interested in renewable resources, but not primarily for carbon reasons. Right, primarily for economic reasons, because diesel is really expensive. We all know the double-edged sword of Alaska's economy. High oil prices might be great for the North Slope and the state's coffer, but it's terrible for people's individual budgets, right? We travel a lot as a state, home heating fuel. And so what's interesting is I would argue there has been a long-running consensus in Alaska to reduce dependence on diesel and petroleum for our energy system, even though that hasn't really been for environmental or climate reasons, right? It's been for economic reasons. All right. So, there's an impossibly large amount to cover here. I really think about these 5 eras contouring the history of Alaskan electrification. A lot of this is going to focus on the rail belt, but of course, this is a statewide issue. I'll run through these pretty quickly here. So, again, the first era we can kind of think of as mining, or you might call it copper, gold, and salmon. I think we were extracting salmon to such a high degree that you might consider it unsustainable mining. But certainly copper and gold are driving a lot of the electricity development at the time. Basically, electricity follows the gold rush throughout Alaska. Anywhere that amasses enough wealth can basically get electricity, right? Infrastructure follows gold wealth. And so, certainly with Alaska's first major gold rush going back to Juneau, we have the development of really innovative infrastructures. This is the Salmon Creek Dam. But this is also occurring in places like Fairbanks. In some of these early electricity developments are what we might call the organic energy regime. The energy was basically being derived from water or wood. You can think about opposite ends of the rail belt, right? Seward in 1904 was bringing online micro hydro from Lowell Creek that flows down through town, and Fairbanks at the same time was building a giant wood powered combined heat and power plant by the Northern Commercial Company. And as Joan Skilbart contends, Fairbanks didn't run on a gold economy; it ran on a wood economy. More people were employed in the wood trade in Fairbanks than were employed mining gold. The power plant there, I don't have a good slide of it. It would burn 14 or 15,000 cords of wood in a winter, right? We wonder why all the trees were chopped down all throughout Fairbanks, right? And I'll get to there in a moment. So it's really ironic to think of, I think as history professors always take pains to emphasize, we think about these individualistic, hard scrabbling pioneers of the gold rush. These were not people who were living out in the wilderness and didn't want to have any luxuries with them. They brought as many luxuries as they possibly could, as many modern amenities as they could, including electricity. And so, yeah, we have some of these early interesting developments. And I talk about salmon too, because a lot of this early electricity production is happening at salmon canneries down by the coast as well. So for the early part of the state's history, southeastern Alaska is really the electric king. They have over 30 developed water power sites with a total capacity of 11.5 megawatts. And most of the electrification of Alaska was a decentralized affair between the 1890s and early 1920s. The exception of that was southeast because these hydro facilities might have been a few miles outside of town. So you had to string long distance transmission lines to bring that power into town. And that was a very different development than what we were seeing elsewhere throughout the state. All right, so there's the Northern Commercial Company's boiler, right? They had 4 of these boilers, something like 25 cords of wood per hour to keep this running. Combined heat and power, they're producing steam and they're producing electricity. And this made a big difference, right? Circle didn't have these facilities, so this helped put Fairbanks on the map, right? If you're a miner and you can choose between a place with electricity and steam heat and one without, I think we all know what you're gonna pick. We have the early railroads. This is the Tanana Valley Railroad, wood-powered railroad. I won't talk too much about this, but this is the early railroad era. One of the fascinating things about this is they had electric speeders that ran up and down that railroad in 1912, 1913. We're talking about electric vehicles, electrification today. This is quite old, right? People were very excited about electricity at the turn of the century. Also talk about, there's a connection here to Juneau. Let's see. We'll get there in a minute. What I want to really say about the railroad here that's important, by the way, some of these developments, Alaska always challenges your best laid plans, right? So this is electric infrastructure out in Nome being disrupted after a major storm. When we think about the railroad, we really need to think about the Copper River in Northwest and the Alaska Railroad. Copper River in Northwest, obviously, with Kennecott and the whole developments there. Those mines fundamentally relied on electric infrastructure. They had a giant central generating plant. You can still see it if you go out to McCarthy today, right? This is still surviving. I mean, it's a huge facility. They originally burned wood. They eventually burned diesel. They wanted to burn Alaska coal, but because of that progressive era Theodore Roosevelt policy, they couldn't access Alaskan coal for this facility. I think they ended up using Canadian coal on that railroad. But really, when we think about coal, we should think about the Alaska Railroad. The location of the Alaska Railroad was built depending on the coal mines, right? The coal mines of the Matanuska Valley and the coal mines of Healing. And the railroad enabled coal. It both enabled coal and it relied upon coal. The government railroad, as they called it, and the US military have driven the vast majority of coal production and consumption in Alaska's history. The federal government was actually owning some of those original mines. If we look at the first power plants up and down the rail belt, again, this concept of the rail belt deserves further consideration. They were at those mines and they were up and down the railroad. So Eska, Chickaloon had early power plants. Nenana in 1917. Got raising the stack on the Nenana power plant back in 1917, and they'd have electric sawmills associated with these productions. No, my time is relatively short. We can go back and talk about some of this later. First power plant in Anchorage, right? Coal-powered steam plant run by the railroad, and then 2 major coal plants that were enabled from this. This is the Connect Arm power plant down in Anchorage that operated 50s through the 80s. And on the left here, this is the FE Company's plant in Fairbanks. The FE Company, the railroad enabled industrial mining at Fairbanks. And what happened is that they brought the infrastructure for these giant dredges with the railroad. All these dredges were electrified, right? We had a central generating plant in Fairbanks, strung the electric lines out to run these dredges. Very, very innovative at the time, but also important as we'll talk about contemporary context of electrification. Should also mention with the growth of Anchorage, you get hydro from Eklutna Lake. This is the first hydro project, 3 megawatt hydro project back in the 1920s in Eklutna. This gets surpassed by the Bureau of Reclamation's 30 megawatt project at Eklutna in the 1950s that there's much controversy about today. always interesting, these early power companies are encouraging people to use more electricity. Because that was the basis of their business model. Gonna have to go through a lot of this. As Ian mentioned, I think World War II is more important for Alaska history than the gold rush. It's the single most important event that we have to look at. Look at all these projects that are built during World War II. I mean, there's a ton of them. If we think about defense electrification, some of the largest power plants in the state are built by the military, right? Built by the military all throughout the state. And then in addition to the military, we have the Bureau of Reclamation, right? Building the Eklutna project, still to this day, the cheapest power we have on the rail belt, less than 4 cents per kilowatt hour, built back in the 50s. We also have the Stonesham project down in Juneau, right? One of the reasons Juneau is basically 100% hydro is because of that Bureau of Reclamation project back in the 70s. So really important involvement of the federal government. I know it's a perennial refrain from our politicians that the federal government doesn't give us anything, but I think we as historians have a different perspective. Only nuclear power plant ever built in Alaska, right? This is down at Fort Greely, operated for a decade. Tricky history there. That really matters because they're bringing micronuclear back to Eielson, right? They're claiming 2027. I don't think it's going to happen by then, but we'll see what happens. Then we have that Eklutna project in the 1950s, really consequential. I'm basically out of time, so let me just wrap up here. Of course, there's all these proposed things that don't happen. We all know about the Rampart Dam, but did you know about the plan to tap Cook Inlet tidal in the 1950s by damming the Connect Arm here? Yeah, you can stare at this one for a little while. So plenty of these projects don't come to fruition, right? They don't happen. And I think most of us can agree that it's probably a good thing. Okay, why does electrification matter today? I won't talk about, there's this era of, we think about the oil era. I would just argue we need to think about oil and water. The state did something very wise with those oil monies. We invested it in hydroelectricity. Right? Most important, Bradley Lake down here on the rail belt, but also the 4-dam pool, different dams throughout Alaska, Kodiak, Valdez, Ketchikan, investing in AVAC, we can talk about that. And we built the intertie. We connected the rail belt, finally. There's dreams of connecting the rail belt going all the way back to the railroad. This made it so that you could have an electron that's produced out of Bradley Lake and sent all the way up to Fairbanks. And so that's, this is basically the outline of the grid that we get today. This is 1994. So I'll just conclude by this. Why does this matter today? I think we're in an era of climate and clean tech, right? Basically, if you listen to scholars, the fastest way to decarbonize our economy is to electrify everything and run it off of zero carbon energy. And so the history of this really matters for our future. As we're looking at the different electrical cooperatives and their different decarbonized visions, we really need to look at history and what has worked and what hasn't worked in our electrification there. And of course, this is also a period that's marked by extraordinary climate disruption. And so we need to have our eyes wide open to that. But there's also a lot of possibilities, and there's a lot of economic development that can happen here. Bill Schneider and I drove down from Fairbanks in an electric car, right? We use less than 6 gallons of gasoline equivalent to make that happen. Right, all the way from Fairbanks over 500 miles. So these tools and technologies are efficient and they're available, but we've got to learn from history. Thank you.
Take some questions for Phil.
Here's Ian.
Stand by right now. I'm curious, why did the tidal power in Cook Inlet not happen? Because environmentally, I get why let's not do that now, but in the 50s,
Yeah.
I've seen some of that discussion.
In some ways, for the exact same reasons that Rampart failed, right? It was producing way more power than the rail belt needed, and it was doing it in an environmentally disruptive way. So the response to that gentleman's proposal by the feds, I mean, they basically dismiss them. They're like, what are you going to use this power for? Why do we need this power? Right? Dismiss that. Yeah.
So some folks are probably coming down from Anchorage. Something happened that I never remember happening at Anchorage in the last year, which was that there was a really deeply contested election on the Chugach board. And I watched this just sort of mesmerized because it was a real debate, like a real debate broke out about who was gonna be seated on the Chugach board, Chugach Electric, Public Utilities. And so you made this offhand comment about, these cooperatives not always being very cooperative. And I started to think in the midst of this debate, it's like, wow, how wonderful would it be to write like a history of these public utilities boards? And I think that I think there's not a lot known about them and the politics of them. And I think now we're coming to this point where this is a preview of what's gonna happen, particularly as these debates play out about like our sources of energy and how much are we gonna swing into electric. I mean, you can really imagine a situation where a seat on a board of a public utility is gonna be as contested as your school board, as your, your local mayoral race, whatever the case is. And so I'm just thinking, if you could say like a little bit more about that kind of offhand comment you made about public utilities being contentious in the cooperatives, that really struck me.
Yeah, so I mean, I love that we have a public utility election that's getting all this attention and that there's a vigorous debate about that. That was not always the case. The electric utility industry used to be the most boring and conservative around, and conservative for a good reason, right? You don't want to be risky when you're talking about a product where reliability is the main thing. Climate has changed, right? Climate change, the urgency to decarbonize, and it's changed the politics of these boards. Historically, the co-ops have not always worked well together because Chugach was the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Chugach had access to cheap natural gas, including, owning the part of the Beluga field today, after the merger. And so Chugach had these supply agreements with Homer Electric Association and Matanuska Electric Association, where for the vast majority of the history of those co-ops from basically the 40s and 50s onward, Chugach supplied them their power. I just found this thing back in the early Homer newspaper from the 1950s, and this was like only a couple of years after Homer Electric Association was formed, and they were complaining about things Chugach was doing back then, and then MEA republished it in like the Valley Settler, Valley Pioneer, whatever the name of that newspaper was. And so I think those disputes go all the way back to the beginning, and there's I don't know the full history, but there's real resentment about Chugach being the dominant power provider. And then what happens is in 2013, 2014, HEA and MEA go off on their own ways and they build out a bunch of generations so they can take care of themselves and they don't need to rely on Chugach. But it's unfortunate because we really don't have a big market, yet we have all these little democratic entities, but they're not always playing well. So it took the Alaska legislature to mandate that they work together. Yeah, and they're working it out. They're probably working better today than any time before, which is good.
Tell us about your recharge experience driving down the highway.
Yeah, almost 100% positive. We now have enough chargers down from Fairbanks. They call it the Sparks Highway. I won't go too deep into the stories, but for various reasons, a bunch of those chargers are free. So it took us $20 to get down here, right? Not including vehicle wear, right? Only issue we had with the charger was here in Sterling. Couldn't get it to work, but we were close enough to town that we had no problem. So we're still kind of on the bleeding edge of this. I wouldn't recommend the average Alaskan go out and buy an EV tomorrow. Plug-in hybrid for sure. But I think we're going to see this change happening really quickly because of adoption curves. Basically, with a new technology, once it passes 5% of people adopting it, you have accelerated development. We've just passed 7% of new vehicle sales in the United States being electric vehicles, right? All of the major manufacturers saying they're going to not produce internal combustion engine vehicles 2035, something like that. So it's coming, and for my part, it's a much better driving experience. It's quiet, it's fast. I mean, these things are it's public safety issue. They're very fast. But it is it's a superior consumer experience, which is why I think it's going to win in the long run.
I will say that technically we're in our break time. There's going to be the meeting at 10, but we still have 20-25 minutes. And if people have other questions for either Pierce or Ian, feel free to chime in.
You guys together to talk about public power, public infrastructure?
I think so. I think there's a dissertation out there about public utility.
I agree, you gotta be worthy graduates.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.